The matte black armored sedan glided like a shadow through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, stopping silently before the private elevator of the city's most exclusive penthouse. Jang Do-Hyun, the man whose name was whispered in fear from the back alleys of Incheon to the boardrooms of Gangnam, decided to return 6 hours early from a brutal business negotiation. After a week of dismantling rival factions and solidifying his status as the most powerful mafia boss in the country, he wasn't interested in the spoils of war. His mind was on the 70-year-old woman waiting inside, Mama Zola. Though she didn't share his blood, she was the only reason he was still breathing. When the world had left him to freeze as a starving 7-year-old orphan on the streets of Chicago, it was Zola, a tireless immigrant widow, who had found him. She had shared her last bowl of rice with him and worked 3 cleaning jobs just to buy him the suit he wore to his first interview. Do-Hyun stepped out of the car, adjusting his cufflinks. He had brought her a rare tin of hand-picked tea from the mountains, a small tribute to the woman who had raised a king from the gutters. He entered the penthouse through the service corridor, wanting to surprise her with the scent of the tea before she even heard his footsteps. But as he reached the foyer, a sound made his blood turn to ice. It wasn't the sound of a peaceful home, but the sharp, venomous tone of his wife, Elena. "How many times do I have to tell you? You stay in the shadows where you belong," Elena's voice hissed, devoid of the elegance she showed the world. "You're a blind, useless burden, and I'm done smelling your poverty in my house." The silence of the penthouse was not the peaceful tranquility Jang Do-Hyun had paid millions to secure. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that tasted of cold ash. He stood paralyzed behind the shadow of the obsidian pillar, the small, ornate tin of mountain tea pressing into his palm like a jagged stone. From his vantage point, the opulence of the living room, the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the neon veins of Seoul, and the priceless white leather furniture, felt like a stage set for a nightmare. 10 feet away, the woman he called his wife stood with her back to him, her silk-red dress shimmering like a fresh wound against the monochromatic decor. She was leaning forward, her posture vibrating with a predatory energy he had never seen during their 3 years of marriage. In front of her sat Mama Zola. The sight sent a surge of white-hot adrenaline through Do-Hyun's veins that he had to fight to suppress. The woman who had been his North Star, whose hands were once the only warm thing in a frozen Chicago winter, was bound. Coarse, brown hemp rope bit into her frail wrists, pulling her arms upward in a position that forced her to strain just to keep her balance. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, her clouded, milky eyes staring into a void she could not see, yet her face bore an expression of such quiet, dignified endurance that it broke Do-Hyun's heart more than a scream ever could. "Did you really think he cared about you?" Elena's voice sliced through the air, dripping with a casual, bored cruelty. She reached out, her manicured finger flicking the silver crucifix hanging around Zola's neck. "You're just a charity project he forgot to close. A relic from a past he's ashamed of. Do you know what he smells when he looks at you, Zola? He smells the grease of the kitchens you scrubbed. He smells the poverty he worked so hard to kill." Mama Zola's lips moved, a dry whisper barely audible over the hum of the climate control. "Do-Hyun is a good boy. He has a heart of gold." Elena erupted into a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the minimalist walls. She grabbed a glass of expensive champagne from the side table and poured it slowly onto the floor, inches from Zola's bare feet. "A heart of gold? He's a monster who cleans up the city's filth, and I am the one who makes him presentable to the world. You're an eyesore. A blind, bumbling shadow that makes our guests uncomfortable." She leaned in closer, her breath likely hot against Zola's ear. "I've already started the paperwork, old woman. By the time he gets back from his trip, you'll be in a room with 4 white walls where no one has to hear your stories about the old days ever again. And the best part? He won't even fight it. I've already told him your mind is rotting. He believes me." Do-Hyun closed his eyes for a single second, his breathing shallow and silent. The betrayal was a physical weight, but the realization was deeper. He wasn't just looking at a cruel wife. He was looking at an enemy who had infiltrated his most sacred sanctuary. He didn't step out. He didn't roar. He remained in the shadows, a ghost in his own home, watching as Elena pulled the ropes tighter. He would not give her the mercy of a quick confrontation. He would wait until he had unraveled every thread of her deception, ensuring that when he finally stepped into the light, there would be nothing left of her world but ruins. For now, he memorized every tear that tracked down Mama Zola's weathered cheek, fueling a vengeful fire that would soon consume everything Elena held dear. The memory hit Do-Hyun with the force of a physical blow, transporting him away from the cold marble of the penthouse and back to a time when the cold was not a design choice, but a predator. 30 years ago, Seoul was a different world for a child with no name and no place to belong. The winter of 1994 had been particularly brutal, a season of biting winds that sliced through the thin plastic sheets of the alleyway shanties. 7-year-old Do-Hyun had been huddled behind a row of rusted trash bins near a small, flickering market stall, his fingers so numb they felt like brittle twigs ready to snap. He had spent 3 days surviving on half-frozen rinds of fruit discarded by vendors, his stomach a hollow ache that had long since transcended hunger into a dull, throbbing sickness. It was there, in the deepest blue of a sub-zero twilight, that a shadow had fallen over him. He had flinched, expecting the usual kick from a shopkeeper or the harsh shout of a policeman. Instead, he saw a pair of worn, sensible boots. He looked up to find a woman with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that held a warmth the winter couldn't touch. Mama Zola was a newcomer to the neighborhood then, a widow who worked as a night shift cleaner at the nearby hospital. She didn't speak much Korean yet, and he knew no English, but when she saw the shivering boy, she didn't ask for a permit or a reason. She simply reached down with hands roughened by lie and hard labor and pulled him into the heat of her threadbare coat. In her tiny, one-room apartment that smelled of bleach and toasted sesame, she had sat him down on a heated floor mat that barely worked. With a quiet hum, she placed a chipped ceramic bowl in his hands. It was filled with plain white rice, steaming, pearly, and fragrant. To the starving boy, that bowl of rice represented more than a meal. It was the first evidence he had ever seen that the world was capable of kindness. She watched him eat with a gaze of fierce, protective intensity, and when he finished, she didn't send him back to the street. She simply pointed to a small pile of blankets in the corner and said the only Korean word she had mastered perfectly, "Sajo, stay." She had spent the next 2 decades sacrificing her own health to ensure he never felt that cold again. She had hidden her own hunger so he could have books. She had worked double shifts so he could wear a clean shirt to school. Every scar Do-Hyun carried from his rise through the underworld was a testament to his will to survive, but every ounce of his humanity belonged to the woman who had shared her last grain of rice with a ghost. Now, standing in the shadows of his own empire, seeing her bound and mocked by a woman who had never known a day of true hunger, Do-Hyun felt the orphan within him stir. The debt he owed was not measured in the billions he possessed, but in the heat of that first bowl of rice, a debt he intended to settle with a cold, absolute finality. Returning to his private study, a soundproofed vault of chrome and glass hidden behind a false wall, Do-Hyun collapsed into his leather chair. The room remained dark, save for the ghostly blue glow of a dozen monitors that flickered to life at his touch. His fingers, usually steady enough to handle a firearm or sign multi-million-dollar contracts, trembled slightly as he bypassed the penthouse's standard security and accessed his private, encrypted cloud. He didn't look at the live feed. He couldn't bear to see Mama Zola bound for another second without breaking his vow of silence. Instead, he scrolled back through the archives of the past 3 weeks, the duration of his supposed business trip to Busan. The footage he found was a descent into a specialized kind of hell. He watched, accelerated and silent, as the woman he thought was his partner transformed into a calculated monster. He saw Elena dragging Mama Zola by the arm into the windowless basement laundry room. He saw her dumping out the traditional seaweed soup Zola had painstakingly prepared, replacing it with a bowl of unseasoned porridge. But the most chilling discovery came from the footage recorded just 2 nights prior in their master bedroom. Elena was standing before her vanity mirror, illuminated by the soft glow of ring lights. She wasn't sleeping or reading, she was performing. Do-Hyun watched in a trance of pure horror as his wife practiced crying. She would squeeze her eyes shut, wait for a tear to bead, and then check the angle of her face in the glass. "I just don't know what else to do, Judge," she whispered to her reflection, her voice a perfect imitation of a grieving, exhausted daughter-in-law. "She's becoming violent. She doesn't recognize me anymore. For her own safety, for Do-Hyun's peace of mind, she needs to be at Sunny Acres." She repeated the lines over and over, adjusting the tremor in her lower lip and the way she tucked a stray blonde hair behind her ear to look more vulnerable. She even practiced a look of startled fear, as if reacting to an invisible attack from the blind woman. Beside her on the vanity lay a stack of forged medical reports from a clinic Do-Hyun knew was a front for syndicate money laundering. It was a masterpiece of sociopathy. She wasn't just abusing a helpless woman, she was choreographing a legal execution of Zola's freedom. Do-Hyun watched the screen, his face a mask of cold obsidian. He had seen many forms of evil in the underworld, betrayals, hits, and power grabs, but this rehearsed cruelty, this meticulous preparation to steal a mother from her son, was a transgression that demanded a price beyond mere money. The ghost in the security feed had shown him the truth. The woman in his bed was a phantom, and the war for his mother's life had already begun. The digital rabbit hole went deeper than family betrayal, spiraling into the dark abyss of international crime. Do-Hyun's eyes narrowed as he pulled up the financial records of the Loran International Art Foundation, the prestigious non-profit Elena managed with such public grace. To the high society of Seoul, it was a beacon of culture and philanthropy, hosting galas that featured avant-garde sculptures and forgotten masterpieces. But as Do-Hyun's proprietary algorithms stripped away the layers of shell companies and offshore transfers, the art began to look like something far more pragmatic. The foundation wasn't buying paintings, it was moving weight. Every major donation coincided with a shipment of sculptures arriving at Incheon port, heavy, lead-lined crates that bypassed standard customs thanks to Elena's high-level connections. The money didn't stay in the foundation's accounts for more than an hour before being splintered into 1,000 digital fragments and routed to the Cayman Islands, eventually pooling into the accounts of the White Tiger Syndicate. Do-Hyun felt a cold smirk touch his lips, though his heart remained a block of ice. The White Tigers were his primary rivals, a fractured but violent group he had spent the last year systematically dismantling. He had assumed their recent desperation was due to his pressure on their shipping lanes, but now he realized they had a parasite burrowed deep inside his own home. Elena wasn't just a cruel socialite, she was an asset. She had been placed in his path 4 years ago at a charity auction, a masterclass in espionage designed to gain access to the Mafia's internal ledgers and Do-Hyun's personal vulnerabilities. Every kiss, every "I love you," and every shared meal had been a data-gathering exercise for the enemy. She had targeted Mama Zola not just out of spite, but because the elderly woman was the only one who possessed a blind intuition. Zola had often remarked that Elena's voice smelled like iron and dry earth. A sensory warning Do-Hyun had foolishly dismissed as the eccentricities of age. He found a hidden directory titled Project Sunset. Opening it revealed a scanned copy of his own private security protocols and a list of his safe houses, all marked with Elena's elegant digital signature. She was preparing to hand over his entire empire to the White Tigers the moment Mama Zola was out of the way and the guardianship was finalized. She needed Zola gone because the old woman's presence meant Do-Hyun stayed grounded in the penthouse, With her in an asylum, Elena could fully manipulate his schedule and environment. Do-Hyun leaned back, the blue light of the monitor casting long, sharp shadows across his face. He wasn't just dealing with a domestic abuser, he was dealing with a spy who had used his mother's body as a punching bag while she plotted his execution. The foundation of his life had been a lie, but Elena had made one fatal mistake. She had forgotten that a man who grew up on the streets of Chicago didn't just play by the rules, he rewrote them in blood and fire. The Art Foundation was about to host its final, most expensive exhibition, and Elena Laurent would be the centerpiece of the wreckage. The following morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, deceptive shadows across the breakfast table. Do-Hyun sat in his usual chair, the morning paper crisp in his hands, though he didn't read a single word. He was a master of the Mafia mask, a vacuum of emotion that revealed nothing of the fury vibrating beneath his skin. Across from him, Elena moved with the fluid grace of a swan, her silk robe trailing behind her as she prepared a breakfast that looked like a work of art. The scent of artisan coffee and toasted sourdough filled the air, a domestic fragrance that now smelled to Do-Hyun like the metallic tang of a crime scene. "She had another episode last night, darling," Elena said softly, her voice a hushed melody of feigned concern. She set a plate of poached eggs in front of him, her hand lingering briefly on his shoulder with a touch that made his skin crawl. "It's getting so much worse. While you were in the shower, I found her wandering near the balcony. She was confused, calling out for someone named Marcus and insisting the floor was covered in water." Do-Hyun looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. He didn't blink. Mama Zola has never known a Marcus. And her spatial awareness, even without sight, is usually perfect. Elena sighed, a masterpiece of a sound that combined exhaustion with saintly patience. She sat down, cradling her coffee mug as if seeking warmth. "That's the tragedy of it, Do-Hyun. The mind creates its own ghosts when it starts to fray. She became quite aggressive when I tried to lead her back to her room. She actually scratched my arm." Elena pulled back her sleeve just enough to reveal a faint, red mark, a mark Do-Hyun knew she had likely inflicted upon herself with her own manicured nails after watching her rehearsal in the mirror. "I'm frightened, not for me, but for her. What if she wanders out into the hallway? Or worse, what if she leaves the stove on? I've had to start locking certain doors just to keep her contained. It breaks my heart to treat her like a prisoner, but what choice do I have?" Do-Hyun took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. Every word she spoke was a brick in the wall she was building around his mother, a wall intended to entomb Zola in an asylum. "You've been doing so much, Elena. I didn't realize the burden was this heavy." "It's a labor of love," she whispered, her eyes brimming with those practiced, glistening tears he had seen on the security feed. "But the doctors at the clinic, the specialists I consulted, they were very firm. They said that keeping her here is actually a form of cruelty. She needs professional, 24-hour psychiatric care. They have a bed opening at Sunny Acres tomorrow. I think we need to sign the papers today, for her sake." She reached across the table, her fingers interlacing with his. To any observer, it was the picture of a devoted wife supporting her husband through a family crisis. But Do-Hyun felt the cold calculation in her grip. She was pushing for the signature before he had a chance to spend too much time with Zola, before the early return surprise wore off. He looked at the woman he had once shared his bed with, marveling at the sheer depth of her depravity. She was serving him a tea ceremony of lies, seasoned with the slow-acting poison of gaslighting. "You're right," Do-Hyun said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that she mistook for grief. "We should ensure she is exactly where she deserves to be. Bring me the papers this evening. I'll settle everything." Elena's smile was small and triumphant, a flicker of the predator behind the veil. She had no idea that the settling Do-Hyun had in mind would involve a ledger written in a currency she wasn't prepared to pay. He watched her go, his eyes turning back to the obsidian pillar where, Just hours before, he had seen his mother's dignity hanging by a hemp rope. The trap was set, and Elena was walking into it with a smile on her face. Later that afternoon, after Elena had departed for a charity committee meeting, likely a clandestine rendezvous with her syndicate contacts, Do-Hyun slipped into Mama Zola's room. He bypassed the main door, entering through a concealed panel used by security staff. The room was dim, smelling faintly of the lavender sachets she had always loved, but the air felt heavy with the lingering echo of Elena's cruelty. Do-Hyun approached the bed where Zola sat, her back straight, her sightless eyes fixed on the window. The ropes were gone, replaced by angry red welts on her wrists that made Do-Hyun's vision blur with a protective rage. "Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in a decade. "I'm here. I saw everything." He expected her to break down, to weep into his shoulder as she had when he was a boy. Instead, Mama Zola turned her head toward the sound of his voice, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. "I know you were there, my son. I could smell the mountain tea you were carrying. It's a beautiful scent." She reached out, her hand finding his with an accuracy that startled him. She didn't tremble. Instead, she squeezed his fingers with a strength that spoke of the iron-willed woman who had survived the streets of Chicago. "Do-Hyun, listen to me. I am blind, but I am not broken. And I am certainly not as helpless as that woman believes." She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a small, high-tech digital recorder, a device Do-Hyun recognized as one from his own private collection. "You taught me long ago that in your world, information is the only shield." When she began her lessons 3 weeks ago, she thought I was a confused old woman who couldn't find the kitchen. She spoke freely. She laughed about the white tigers. She bragged about the forged papers and the doctors she bought. Zola tapped the device. "It's all here. Every insult, every confession of her work for the syndicate, and the names of the men she meets at the Art Foundation. I let her tie those ropes, Do-Hyun. I let her pour that champagne on my feet. I needed her to be arrogant. An arrogant enemy is a loud enemy." Do-Hyun stared at her, a profound sense of awe washing over him. While he had been mourning her frailty, she had been conducting a counterintelligence operation from within her own prison. She hadn't been a victim, she had been a lure. "She thinks she is taking me to a hospital tomorrow," Zola said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "She thinks she has one. But she has only provided us with the stage for her own confession. Don't be sad for me, my boy. A few scratches are a small price to pay to protect the empire you built. Now, take this. Use what is on this tape to tear her world down. But remember, save the final blow for the gala. I want to be there to hear the sound of her falling." Do-Hyun took the recorder, feeling the weight of her sacrifice and her brilliance. He realized then that he hadn't just been raised by a saint, he had been raised by a lioness. The blind woman's secret was the final piece of the puzzle, and as he looked into her clouded eyes, he saw a reflection of the cold, absolute justice he was about to unleash. Elena Laurent had tried to play a game of shadows with the woman who lived in them, and she was about to find out just how dark those shadows could get. The morning of the hearing arrived with a deceptive serenity, the penthouse bathed in a cold, clinical light that seemed to mirror the surgical precision of the trap being laid. Elena was a vision of coordinated grief, dressed in a muted charcoal suit, her eyes expertly reddened to suggest a night of sleepless worry. She paced the length of the living room, a stack of legal folders clutched to her chest like a shield. With her were 2 men in sharp, navy blazers, the specialists from the clinic, who carried the heavy scent of expensive cologne and practiced indifference. They were the architects of the guardianship trap, hired to lend a medical veneer to a kidnapping, and they looked at the boundlessly wealthy surroundings with the hungry eyes of wolves entering a new territory. "Do-Hyun, honey, they're here," Elena called out, her voice trembling with a fabricated fragility that made Do-Hyun's jaw tighten. He emerged from his study, his face an unreadable mask of obsidian. He watched as the doctors moved toward Mama Zola's room, their clipboards ready to finalize the institutionalization that would strip her of her personhood. Elena leaned into him, her hand gripping his arm with a desperate intensity. "This is the hardest day of our lives, but we're doing the right thing. Once the papers are signed, she'll be safe. We can finally move on with our lives." Do-Hyun looked down at the documents Elena had placed on the Italian marble island, the commitment order and the power of attorney that would give her total control over the Thompson family assets in the event of his absence. The air was thick with the suffocating pressure of her expectation. The doctors emerged from the hallway, leading a dressed and ready Mama Zola. She walked with a cane, her clouded eyes fixed forward, her face a mask of tragic confusion that was so convincing it nearly made Do-Hyun doubt the recorder in his pocket. She looked every bit the delusional burden Elena had described, stumbling slightly as she reached the center of the room. "She's ready for transport," the taller doctor said, his voice a flat, bureaucratic drone. "We just need the final signature from the next of kin to activate the emergency guardianship." Elena pushed the pen toward Do-Hyun, her eyes wide and pleading, shimmering with those rehearsed tears. This was the moment she had engineered for years, the intersection of her syndicate mission and her personal greed. She was holding her breath, her pulse visible in the hollow of her throat, convinced that she had finally cornered the most dangerous man in Seoul. Do-Hyun picked up the pen, the weight of it feeling like a weapon. He looked at Mama Zola, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a lioness waiting for the signal to strike. He didn't sign the commitment order. Instead, he pulled a separate, folded document from his inner pocket, a confession of criminal conspiracy he had drafted the night before, and laid it over her papers. "I agree," Do-Hyun said, his voice dropping into a register that made the doctors flinch. "It is time for someone to be institutionalized. But the facility I've chosen doesn't have a garden, Elena. And the doctors there don't take bribes." He watched the triumph drain from Elena's face, replaced by a flickering, panicked confusion as he slowly began to unscrew the cap of the pen. The silence in the penthouse suddenly loud with the ticking of a clock she hadn't realized was counting down to her own destruction. The grand hall of the Seoul Contemporary Art Center was a cavern of shimmering glass and high society whispers, perfumed with the scent of lilies and the arrogance of the elite. Elena Lauren moved through the crowd like a queen about to be crowned, her red gown trailing behind her like a river of blood. She held a flute of vintage champagne, her smile radiant as she accepted congratulations for the Heritage of Grace exhibition. Tonight was supposed to be the final masterstroke, the public debut of her dominance, coinciding with the news of Mama Zola's tragic mental decline. Beside her, Do-Hyun walked with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had already won the war, his black tuxedo a stark contrast to the colorful vultures surrounding them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena's voice rang out, clear and melodic, as she stepped onto the central dais. The room went silent, all eyes turning toward the massive, high-definition projection screens that ringed the hall. "Tonight, we celebrate the preservation of beauty. But before we unveil our newest acquisition, I want to thank my husband, Do-Hyun, for his support during our family's recent, private struggles." She cast a mournful, saintly look toward the front row, where Mama Zola sat, poised and dignified, her clouded eyes seemingly fixed on the woman who had sought to destroy her. "Let the images speak for themselves," Elena declared, signaling the technician. But as the lights dimmed, the expected images of Renaissance sculptures did not appear. Instead, the screens flickered with a raw, grainy infrared feed from a dark parking garage. The socialites gasped as they saw Elena, undisguised and cold, handing a thick envelope to the head of the White Tiger Syndicate. The audio, amplified by the hall's world-class sound system, was bone-chillingly clear. "The guardianship papers are ready," Elena's recorded voice hissed from the speakers. "Once the old woman is locked away, Do-Hyun's security codes are yours. I want him neutralized by Friday." The room plunged into a suffocating, horrified silence. Elena's glass shattered on the floor, the champagne spraying her hem. She turned toward the screens, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax figure melting under the heat of the spotlights. The footage shifted. Now, the screen showed the rehearsal in her bedroom, Elena practicing her fake tears, mocking Mama Zola's blindness and laughing about the peasant she was about to discard. The final image was a high-resolution scan of the Laurent Foundation's ledgers, showing the millions siphoned to the syndicate. The art of betrayal is a delicate thing, Elena. Do-Hyun's voice cut through the stillness, amplified by his lapel mic. He stepped onto the stage, not as her husband, but as the boss. You thought you were playing a game of shadows with a blind woman. But you forgot that the woman who raised me taught me how to see through the dark. Mama Zola stood up, her movement fluid and certain, and for the first time, she turned her head directly toward the stage, her presence radiating a power that dwarfed the woman in red. The execution of Elena's reputation was absolute. In the span of 60 seconds, she had gone from the jewel of Seoul to a national pariah. The guests recoiled from her as if she were a leper, their cameras flashing not in admiration, but to capture the visceral fall of a traitor. Elena looked at the exit, but the doors were already flanked by Do-Hyun's silent, stone-faced men. The gala was over, and the real show was about to begin. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of sirens and flashing lights, but for Elena, it was a blur of numbing shock. Shunted into the back of a black sedan by men with faces like granite, she had expected a police station, a lawyer, or perhaps a cold roadside abandonment. Instead, the world faded into a sedative-induced haze. When she finally clawed her way back to consciousness, the first thing she felt was the cold. It was a deep, bone-marrow chill that bit through her silk red gown, which now looked like a tattered rag in the gloom. She was lying on a thin, damp mattress on a concrete floor. There were no windows, no luxury linens, and no scent of lilies, only the smell of wet stone and old iron. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, her hands fumbling in the pitch blackness. Her fingers brushed against the rough texture of a wall, and then something else. A hemp rope, dangling from a hook in the ceiling. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the reality of the room began to settle into her mind. She wasn't in a prison or a hospital. She was in the basement, the very room where she had bound Mama Zola and whispered her most venomous threats. Suddenly, a hidden speaker crackled to life, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. "My mother lived in the dark to save me," Do-Hyun's voice echoed, devoid of all warmth, sounding like it was coming from the center of the earth. "She navigated a world she couldn't see so that I would never have to stumble. You, Elena, had everything: sight, wealth, and love, and yet you chose to be the darkest thing in this house." Elena threw herself against the heavy steel door, screaming for mercy, her manicured nails snapping against the reinforced metal. "Do-Hyun, please. I was a different person. I can change." The doctors at Sunny Acres were quite thorough in their assessment of this room. The voice continued, ignoring her pleas. They agreed that for a person of your mental instability, a period of total sensory isolation is the only cure. You told the world she was losing her mind, so I've decided to let you lose yours in the same silence you forced upon her. You wanted her to live in a world where no one heard her cries. Now you will live in the dark to pay me back." The faint click of a final deadbolt echoed through the speaker, followed by absolute, crushing silence. Above her, the life of the penthouse would go on. Mama Zola would drink her mountain tea in the sun, and the empire would continue to grow. But below the marble floors, in the cold heart of the foundation she had tried to poison, Elena Laurent would remain a shadow in the dark, learning the true cost of a life debt that she had been foolish enough to try and collect. The most profound lesson from Do-Hyun and Mama Zola's journey is that the strongest bonds are not forged in blood, but in the fire of shared sacrifice. This story reminds us that true family is defined by who stands by you when you have nothing, not who flocks to you when you have everything. Mama Zola's bowl of rice represents a debt of love that no amount of money can ever fully repay. It teaches us that kindness to a stranger can change the course of history, turning a starving orphan into a king. Furthermore, the story serves as a powerful reminder that silence is not weakness and vulnerability is not a flaw. While the world saw a helpless blind woman, Do-Hyun saw the pillar of his strength, proving that those who love us unconditionally are our greatest protection. In the end, wealth and power are hollow if not used to shield the innocent. The only legacy that truly endures is the courage to honor those who first believed in us.